The officer's hands were steady, but his eyes were hard as he stared at my passport, not the carry-on bag sitting open on the stainless steel table. No, he was staring at the red alert flashing on his terminal, at my surname Moore printed in bold letters across the screen. Then he signaled to his partner and they stepped in, closing the security lane like someone had pulled the plug on my entire future. "Ms. Moore," he said, his voice a low, clinical rumble. "I need you to step away from the line and come with us right now." He led me to a windowless interrogation room, closed the door, and I heard the heavy thud of the lock engaging. I thought there was a mistake with my flight. My heart was thundering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then he said the words that made the floor fall out from under me. "You aren't going to make that hearing today, Elena. In fact, if you don't start telling me why your own mother reported this passport as stolen an hour ago, you might not be going anywhere for a long time." I laughed. I laughed out loud. "What? My mother? That's impossible. My grandmother's inheritance hearing is in 3 hours. My family is waiting for me at the courthouse." "That's exactly the problem," the officer replied, his face unreadable. "What I'm about to show you will change everything you think you know about your family. But let me start from the beginning because you need to understand how I ended up in this room with handcuffs on the table, learning that my life was being dismantled by the people I shared breakfast with this morning. My name is Elena Moore. I'm 31 years old. I work as a senior cybersecurity consultant for firms that most people have never heard of, and I come from what the locals call vineyard royalty. My grandma Beatrice passed away 3 weeks ago and left me her entire estate, roughly $20 million in land assets, and the historic Moore family vineyard where 5 generations of women in my family had worked the soil. I never acted the part. I didn't wear the designer labels my sister-in-law draped herself in. I worked 80-hour weeks, lived in a modest apartment, and drove a truck that had seen better decades. To my family, I was just the tech girl they ignored at dinner, until the will was read. The inheritance wasn't a paycheck to me. It was a legacy I had promised Beatrice I would protect from the developers. But to my mother Vivian and my brother Caleb, that legacy was nothing more than a life raft for their sinking debts. They thought because I was the quiet daughter, I'd be an easy target to shove aside. I just didn't realize that to get me out of the way, they were willing to turn a crowded airport into a crime scene. The Moore family always viewed my career through a lens of polished condescension. At Sunday dinners, while Caleb bragged about his visionary real estate ventures, most of which were hemorrhaging money, my mother would pat my hand and ask if I was still fixing computers for a living. I let them believe it. I let them think I was a glorified IT technician earning a modest salary, someone who lived in the digital basement of the real world. In reality, I was a high-level security architect. I spend my days building digital fortresses for Fortune 500 companies and my nights tracking the kind of sophisticated financial fraud my brother was currently committing. I make more in a single quarterly bonus than Caleb has earned in his entire life. Before taxes, my income is obscene. After taxes, it's enough to buy the very vineyard they were trying to steal from me. But my family didn't see the powerhouse. They saw a girl who lived in a studio apartment and bought her clothes at thrift stores. They didn't realize that my poverty was a choice, a way to ensure that when I finally took over Beatrice's estate, I would be doing it for the land, not the luxury. Beatrice knew, of course. She was the only one who saw the $20 million estate not as a jackpot, but as a responsibility. She knew that her black sheep granddaughter was the only one with the backbone to keep the developers' bulldozers at bay. They thought they were trapping a mouse by flagging my passport and planting evidence in my luggage. They had no idea they were trying to cage the person who built the digital walls of their entire world. As I sat in that cold interrogation room watching the security camera in the corner, I wasn't afraid. I was calculating. They wanted to play games with my identity? Fine. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to delete the person who holds the master key. The last time I saw Beatrice, the air in her sunroom smelled of dried lavender and the faint metallic tang of the coming winter. She was curled in her favorite wingback chair, her hands, spotted with age but steady as stone, clutching a porcelain teacup. I sat across from her, the IT girl she had always been so proud of, even if she couldn't quite explain to her friends what a firewall actually was. "Elena," she said, her voice a fragile rasp that still commanded the room. "The vineyard is more than just soil and vines. It's a target. To Vivian and Thomas, it's a debt clearance center. To Caleb it's a luxury car and a penthouse he can't afford. She paused, looking out over the rolling hills of the estate, her eyes clouding with a sorrow I didn't fully understand yet. They think you're soft because you don't shout, and they think you're poor because you don't flaunt. It's their greatest weakness, but it's also their most dangerous weapon. The vultures will circle the very second my heart stops beating, and they won't just peck at the remains. They'll try to swallow you whole to get to what's underneath. I had tried to reassure her, reaching out to take her hand. They're family, Grandma. They wouldn't. They aren't family when money is the only god they worship, she interrupted, her grip surprisingly tight. Promise me, Elena. Use those digital keys of yours. Keep the land. Don't let them turn this sanctuary into a parking lot. Sitting in the sterile fluorescent glare of the airport interrogation room, her words tasted like ash in my mouth. She had seen it all coming. She knew that the goodbye hug Vivian gave me this morning wasn't about love. It was a reconnaissance mission. She knew that Caleb's offer to help with my bags was a setup. I had promised her I would protect the legacy, and as I looked at Officer Grant, I realized the vultures hadn't just circled. They had finally descended. But Beatrice had left me one more thing besides the land. She had left me the permission to stop playing the quiet daughter and start being the predator they never saw coming. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room hummed with a clinical indifference, but my mind was miles away, replaying the morning like a security reel in slow motion. I could see the steam rising from the coffee Vivian had insisted on making me, her hands trembling slightly as she handed me the mug. At the time I thought it was grief. Now I knew it was the adrenaline of a thief. Safe travels, Elena, she had whispered, pulling me into a hug that lasted a few seconds too long. It was a stifling, performative embrace, her silk scarf smelling of expensive perfume and betrayal. While her right hand patted my back in a motherly rhythm, her left hand drifted toward the open pocket of my carry-on, resting on the chair beside us. I remembered the faint metallic jingle of my keys, a sound I'd dismissed as her jewelry. It wasn't her bracelet, it was the sound of my life being swapped for a forgery. Caleb had been the distraction, hovering near the door with my suitcase, complaining about the weight and the ancient state of my belongings. You really should let me get you a real bag for the hearing, Elle. This thing looks like it's held together by luck and dust. He'd made a show of struggling with the zipper, his back turned to me for less than 10 seconds. Just enough time to slip a small vacuum-sealed packet of white powder beneath the lining of the front pocket. The precision of it was almost impressive. They had played their roles perfectly, the grieving widow and the concerned brother. They'd even walked me to the car, waving until I turned the corner, looking for all the world like a family united in loss. In that interrogation room, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just wanted me to miss the flight, they wanted me in a jumpsuit. By reporting my real passport as stolen while I was in the air, Vivian ensured that the moment I scanned the forgery at security, the trap would snap shut. They weren't just vultures. They were architects of a digital and physical cage. But as I looked at the black screen of my laptop on the table, I felt a cold, familiar spark. They had used my love for Beatrice to get close enough to burn me. Now I was going to use their arrogance to incinerate them. Officer Grant leaned against the heavy metal door of room 4B, his arms crossed over a chest that looked like it was made of granite. He'd been watching me for 20 minutes, not with the aggression of a cop who'd made a major drug bust, but with the squint of a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. You're very calm, Elena, he noted, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. Most people in your shoes are either crying or screaming about their rights. You're just staring at the wall. I'm not staring at the wall, officer, I said, finally meeting his gaze. I'm thinking about the air tag I sewed into the lining of my original passport case 3 years ago. I'm a cybersecurity expert. I don't lose things. And I certainly don't steal my own identity. Grant stiffened. He pulled a tablet from his belt and tapped the screen. We received a verified tip from Vivian Moore. She claimed you'd been acting erratically, stole her travel documents, and were planning to flee the country with illicit substances to avoid a family legal matter. Check the signal, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, steady whisper. If my mother is at the probate courthouse like she told the police, her GPS should be at 100 Main Street. But if she's the one who actually has my passport, that air tag is going to tell a very different story. The room went silent as Grant began to type. I watched his eyebrows knit together. He stepped out for a moment and I could hear him on his radio, his tone shifting from professional to suspicious. When he returned, he wasn't holding handcuffs. He was holding a printout. "The signal is live," he said, looking at me with a newfound grimness. "It's not at the courthouse. It's moving toward a dumpster behind a pharmacy 3 blocks from your mother's house. And the stolen passport? We just ran a remote ping. It's currently inside a handbag registered to Vivian Moore." He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, the fluorescent light reflecting off his badge. "It seems your family didn't just want you to miss a flight, Elena. They wanted us to do their dirty work. But there's one thing they forgot. I don't like being used as a weapon." Grant didn't just hand me my laptop. He handed me a scalpel. He stood behind me, his reflection caught in the glossy black glass of the screen as I bypassed the biometric locks with a quick tap of my finger. "My family thinks I'm the IT girl, because I can fix a router," I whispered, my fingers flying across the keys with a rhythm that felt like coming home. "They forgot that to fix a system you first have to understand every single way it can be broken." I didn't start with the bank accounts. I started with the ghost. I remotely accessed the family's shared cloud server, the one Caleb used to store his investment brochures. As I had built the network, I had backdoors they didn't even know existed. I navigated past the encrypted folders, straight into the local cache of Caleb's personal device. "There it is," I said, a cold chill settling in my chest. I pulled up his browser history from 48 hours ago. It was a roadmap of malice. "Maximum sentence for illicit possession" was the first hit. Then came the more specific queries: how to hide powder in a suitcase lining, and how to report a stolen passport anonymously. He hadn't even used a VPN. He was so convinced of my incompetence that he hadn't bothered to cover his digital tracks. I felt Grant's hand grip the back of my chair. "He's not even a good criminal," the officer muttered, his voice thick with disgust. "He's arrogant," I corrected. "Arrogance leaves a bigger trail than any virus." I moved deeper, pulling up the metadata from a photo Caleb had taken last night. It was a picture of the very bag of white powder currently sitting in evidence, time-stamped at 11:42 p.m., taken in his bedroom. I began compiling the arsonist's file, a compressed folder containing every search, every timestamp and every GPS ping that proved this wasn't a police matter. It was a coordinated strike. As the progress bar hit 100%, I looked at the clock. The probate hearing was starting in 90 minutes. My mother and brother would be sitting in that front row, wearing their finest morning clothes, waiting for the judge to call my name and hear nothing but silence. They thought they had deleted me from the narrative. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the ending. The heavy oak doors of the county probate court creaked open, admitting a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Vivian Moore led the procession, her face obscured by a veil of black lace that matched her floor-length sable coat. She moved with a practiced rhythmic hitch in her step, the gait of a woman burdened by a grief she had spent all morning rehearsing in front of her vanity mirror. Behind her, Caleb adjusted his cufflinks, his expression a masterpiece of solemn disappointment. "It's just so tragic," I heard Vivian whisper to a nearby clerk, her voice carrying that specific fragile lilt designed to garner sympathy. "We've tried calling Elena all morning. To think she'd miss her own grandmother's final wishes. The poor girl must be more troubled than we feared." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old wood and impending finality. The judge, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from a walnut, peered over his spectacles at the empty chair beside the Moore family's high-priced legal team. My chair. To anyone else, the empty seat looked like an admission of guilt or a sign of catastrophic irresponsibility. To Vivian and Caleb, it was a throne they were seconds away from claiming. I watched them through the lens of a hacked security feed, the split screen on my laptop showing the contrast between their high-fashion mourning and my cold metal interrogation table. Caleb leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, a predatory glint in his eye that he couldn't quite mask with his handkerchief. They were checking the clock. Every second that ticked by was another nail in the coffin of my inheritance. "If the petitioner is not present within the next 10 minutes, the judge announced, his gavel resting ominously on its block, "we will proceed with the default distribution to the secondary heirs." Vivian let out a soft, choked sob into her lace handkerchief, but I saw her hand squeeze Caleb's under the table. It was a victory lap in a room full of witnesses. They thought I was 1,000 miles away, trapped in a cycle of fingerprints and mugshots. They didn't realize that while they were playing to the gallery, I was busy calibrating the frequency. The gavel was raised, but the real hammer was already in my hand. The judge's gavel hovered in the air like a guillotine blade. He adjusted his glasses and looked toward the back of the room, his voice booming through the hallowed silence. For the final time, is the primary petitioner, Elena Moore, present to claim her standing? Vivian let out a sharp, audible exhale that she tried to mask as a sob, leaning her head onto Caleb's shoulder. Caleb, for his part, began to rise, his face a mask of faux resignation. Your Honor, since my sister has clearly vacated her responsibilities, we ask that the courtroom's dual 60-inch monitors, which had been displaying a static screensaver of the county seal, suddenly flickered. A sharp, digital chirp cut through Caleb's sentence, and the screens turned a blinding, clinical white. Then a high-definition video feed snapped into focus. I was there. My face filled the screens, lit by the harsh fluorescent glow of the interrogation room, but I wasn't looking like a victim. I was looking like a technician about to execute a terminal command. Behind me, the blurry but unmistakable uniform of Officer Grant provided a backdrop of legal authority that turned the room's atmosphere to ice. I'm present, Your Honor. My voice resonated through the courtroom's surround sound system, crisp and devoid of the quiet daughter softness they expected. I apologize for the remote entry, but I've been detained at the airport due to a series of logistical interferences orchestrated by the secondary heirs sitting in the front row. The judge froze, his gavel still suspended. Vivian whipped around, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray as she stared at the screen. Caleb's mouth hung open, his hand still frozen on the back of his chair. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of an empty seat. It was the silence of a trap being sprung from 3 towns away. I have submitted a digital brief to the court's clerk, I continued, my fingers moving rhythmically off camera. It contains evidence that my absence was not a choice, but a criminal conspiracy. If the court would look at the newly uploaded Exhibit A, you'll find the GPS logs of my missing passport, currently located in my mother's handbag. The judge didn't even look at Caleb. He turned his eyes to the clerk's terminal. I watched through the security feed as his expression shifted from confusion to a cold, judicial fury. The ticking gavel had stopped. The real trial was just beginning. The courtroom was frozen in a tableau of high-definition shock. On the large monitors, I clicked a final command and the arsonist's file began to scroll, a digital ledger of betrayal that no amount of black lace or expensive tailoring could hide. The judge's eyes darted between the screen and the people in the front row, his expression hardening into something granite-like. Exhibit B, I said, my voice echoing through the chamber with clinical precision. The web history from my brother Caleb's personal laptop, showing 48 hours of research on how to frame a sibling for drug possession. Exhibit C, the time-stamped photo of the illicit substances taken in his own bedroom. And finally, Exhibit D, the live GPS tracking of the passport my mother swore was stolen, currently broadcasting its location from the interior pocket of the handbag she is holding right now. Vivian's hand flew to her bag as if it had suddenly turned white-hot. She looked up at the camera, her veil pushed back to reveal a face twisted in a mixture of terror and snarling resentment. Caleb tried to stand, his chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. This is a fabrication. She's a hacker, Your Honor, she's manipulating the... Silence, the judge thundered, the sound of his gavel finally descending with the weight of a falling mountain. He turned to the bailiffs stationed at the sides of the room. Officers, please secure that handbag and verify the contents. And someone bring the sheriff's deputies in here immediately. The next few minutes were a blur of motion. I watched through the feed as the bailiffs closed in. Vivian didn't even fight. She simply collapsed into her seat, the grieving widow, act evaporating into a hollow, pathetic silence. Caleb, however, struggled, his face turning a mottled purple as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The high-priced lawyers they had hired to steal my inheritance scrambled backward, wanting no part of the forensic firestorm I had unleashed. The evidence of a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice and defraud this estate is overwhelming, the judge stated, his voice cold and final. This hearing is stayed pending criminal charges. The Moore family's standing is revoked. As they were led away, Caleb looked directly into the camera lens. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I simply watched the vultures being escorted to the cages they had built for me. The vineyard was safe, the debt was being called in, and the IT girl had just deleted their future. The heavy silence of the courtroom was replaced months later by the rhythmic, peaceful hum of the vineyard. I stood on the veranda of the Moore estate, a glass of the season's first press in my hand, watching the sunset dip below the rolling hills. The air no longer tasted like airport exhaust or the sterile dust of a courthouse. It smelled of damp earth, ripening grapes, and a freedom I hadn't realized I was missing. Vivian and Caleb were gone. The Moore liquidation hadn't just been a legal maneuver. It was a total excision. After the criminal charges for fraud and filing false police reports were finalized, they were forced to settle their debts by forfeiting the last of their trust interests. They had tried to swallow me whole, but they had only succeeded in choking on their own greed. I walked into the sunroom, the very place where Beatrice had warned me about the vultures. I sat in her wingback chair and opened my laptop, but not to build a firewall or track a thief. I was looking at the new foundation I had established. A scholarship for young women in tech, funded by the very estate my family thought I'd be too soft to manage. Beatrice hadn't just left me land and money. She had left me a puzzle she knew only I could solve. She knew that by making me the sole heir, she was forcing me to finally stop hiding in the digital shadows and step into the light. She had given me the tools to cut the rot out of our family tree, ensuring that the next generation of Moores would be defined by what they built, not what they took. I looked at the portrait of her hanging above the fireplace. She looked back with that same knowing, steady gaze. I realized then that I was never the black sheep. I was the shepherd. I had protected the land, honored the legacy, and proved that a Moore woman doesn't just survive a betrayal, she out-engineers it. I closed the laptop and stepped back out into the cool evening air. The vineyard was quiet, the legacy was secure, and for the first time in my life, the master key didn't belong to a system. It belonged to me. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.